Before the Tang Dynasty transformed China's monetary system, the economy faced a monumental challenge that would have made any modern economist grimace. Imagine attempting to conduct large-scale business transactions by physically carrying hundreds or even thousands of heavy copper coins. This was the reality of Tang Dynasty commerce around the 7th and 8th centuries. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade faced an obstacle that seemed insurmountable at the time: the sheer weight and impracticality of metal currency. They needed a solution. What emerged from this necessity would fundamentally revolutionize how the world understood money itself. This is the story of how China invented paper money during the Tang Dynasty, setting in motion events that would eventually transform global finance. To properly understand how paper money came to be invented in the Tang Dynasty, we must first examine the economic conditions that preceded this extraordinary innovation. For centuries before the Tang emerged, China had relied exclusively on metal currency, primarily copper coins that were strung together in bundles for easier handling and transport. These coins bore Chinese characters and designs, and their use had become deeply embedded in the Chinese economic system. The Song Dynasty, which came after the Tang, would eventually face a critical shortage of copper for coinage. However, even before this shortage became acute, the Tang Dynasty's expansion and increasing trade generated an unprecedented demand for money. The period from approximately the 7th century onward witnessed a tremendous explosion in commercial activity. Trade flourished not only within China's borders, but also along the emerging Silk Road, which connected China to distant markets in Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. This period of economic vitality meant that merchants needed larger quantities of currency to facilitate their increasingly complex transactions. The central government, meanwhile, had initiated significant tax reforms. The so-called twice taxation system, or liang shui fa, required that at least a portion of taxes be paid in monetary form rather than in goods or crops. This represented a fundamental shift in how the government collected revenue, and it dramatically increased the demand for coins in circulation. The problem was obvious. There simply were not enough copper coins available to satisfy this surging demand. Furthermore, strict government policies prohibited merchants from moving coins away from the capital city and into the various circuits or administrative provinces of the empire. The government feared that if coins were scattered throughout the empire, the capital would be depleted of currency, making it difficult to conduct business in Chang'an, the great capital we know today as Xi'an. Facing these constraints, the Tang Dynasty government devised an ingenious solution around the year 800 CE during the reign of Emperor Xianzong, who ruled from 805 to 820. What emerged was a new type of financial instrument that would fundamentally alter the course of economic history. This instrument was called feiqian, which translates beautifully into English as flying money. The colorful name, derived from the tendency of these lightweight paper documents to blow away in the wind, is a poetic reminder that this was indeed something genuinely novel and distinctive. Initially, flying money was not a top-down government creation, but rather emerged from practical necessity among merchants. When merchants traveled to the capital city of Chang'an to conduct business, they faced the daunting prospect of physically transporting large quantities of heavy copper coins for their transactions. This created several problems. The coins were cumbersome and heavy. They made travelers vulnerable to robbery, and government policies strictly limited how many coins could be moved around the empire. Merchants devised a clever workaround. Instead of carrying coins, they would entrust their money to the representative officers of their local governments, to various Tang military units, government commissioners, or to wealthy local families whom they trusted. In exchange for depositing their coins with these trusted entities, merchants received paper certificates or receipts. These certificates documented the amounts of money they had deposited and who had received it. The true genius of this system became apparent when merchants realized these paper certificates could be carried easily during their travels. When they arrived at their destinations and needed to retrieve their money, they would produce their certificates. The local authorities or wealthy families at the destination would cross-check and compare the certificates. If everything matched, the merchant could withdraw their money locally, minus a small handling fee. The system eliminated the need to actually transport heavy coins across long distances. Business could be conducted with the capital using only a small piece of paper. Tea merchants particularly benefited from this innovation. The tea trade was one of China's most valuable and extensive commercial enterprises during the Tang Dynasty. Merchants from Chang'an who wanted to purchase tea in Sichuan and the southwestern regions could now do so using flying money rather than vast quantities of coins. Similarly, merchants from Sichuan who wanted to purchase merchandise in the capital could travel with only paper certificates. This facilitated long-distance trade on an unprecedented scale and helped integrate China's far-flung regions into a more unified economic system. The Tang government, recognizing the utility of this system, did not initially embrace it with open arms. In fact, the central government was deeply suspicious of flying money. It banned the practice repeatedly, worried about losing control of the money supply and fearful that merchants might defraud the system or engage in counterfeiting. The government was right to be cautious. The potential for abuse was substantial. However, the practical benefits proved too significant to ignore. Merchants and the economy simply functioned better with flying money than without it. By the year 812 CE, the government's resistance crumbled, and flying money was officially declared a valid means of payment. This was a watershed moment. The Ministry of Revenue, the Tax Bureau, and the Salt Monopoly Bureau, the three most important fiscal offices in the Tang government, were entrusted with supervising this new financial instrument. Rather than allowing this system to continue as an informal merchant practice, the government began issuing its own flying money certificates and regulating their use. The government charged merchants a fee for this service. Initially, this fee was set at 100 wen, a unit of currency equal to 100 copper coins, for every 1,000 wen of certificate value. This was quite substantial, roughly a 10% fee, and merchants complained bitterly about this exploitative charge, as contemporary records describe it. Nevertheless, the fee represented the government's cut of this revolutionary new system. Merchants paid it because the alternative, hauling around heavy copper coins, was worse. The Tang government imposed an important restriction to prevent the overcirculation of flying money. Local markets were ordered to use various types of silk or ordinary goods for transactions, creating a kind of barter system. Additionally, prefects were required to ensure that coins circulating in their regions were not transported to other places. These rules, while intended to protect the system, actually harmed long-distance trade significantly and created impediments to the development of a unified national economy. However, these restrictions remained in place because the government needed to maintain control over currency circulation. It is crucial to understand that Tang Dynasty flying money, despite its revolutionary nature, had important limitations that prevented it from being true paper currency as we understand it today. Flying money was fundamentally a system of bills of exchange, similar to modern bank drafts or traveler's checks. It was never intended to be used as general legal tender circulating throughout the entire population. These certificates were only valid between two distant points when presented with the corresponding matching tally or authorization. Furthermore, flying money was accessible primarily to wealthy merchants and government officials, not to ordinary people conducting everyday transactions. The circulation of flying money remained restricted compared to what would eventually develop. Most people in the Tang Dynasty never held flying money in their hands. Ordinary farmers, laborers, artisans, and common folk continued to conduct their daily business using copper coins, as they had for centuries. Flying money remained a tool of commerce for the commercial elite and government, a sophisticated financial innovation that operated at the top levels of the economy rather than permeating all economic activity. Additionally, flying money could always be redeemed for hard currency at the capital, though this required paying a redemption fee. The paper certificates themselves had value only because they represented claims on actual copper coins held by the government or trusted merchants. This fundamental backing in metal currency was what gave flying money credibility. If someone doubted the value of their certificate, they could theoretically travel to the capital and exchange it for coins. In practice, this was often impractical and expensive, but the possibility existed. Despite its limitations, flying money proved remarkably successful within its sphere of operation. The system remained in use throughout the Tang Dynasty and continued into the early years of the Song Dynasty that followed. For over a century, flying money functioned as an important tool for facilitating long-distance trade. It particularly benefited merchants involved in the salt trade, tea commerce, and other high-value transactions that required moving significant quantities of money across great distances. The success of flying money in the Tang Dynasty demonstrated several important economic principles. First, it showed that people were willing to use representative money paper claims on actual valuable goods rather than insisting on holding physical commodities. This willingness to place faith in a medium of exchange that represented value rather than possessing inherent value itself was essential for the later development of true paper money. Second, it demonstrated that commerce could function more efficiently when the burden of transporting heavy currency was eliminated. Third, it proved that the government could play a role in managing and regulating sophisticated financial systems. To fully appreciate the significance of the Tang Dynasty's invention of flying money, we must understand how this innovation eventually evolved into genuine paper currency during the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279 CE, inherited the financial traditions of the Tang, but faced its own distinct challenges and opportunities. By the time the Song Dynasty emerged, China faced a different monetary crisis. The supply of copper for making coins had become severely constrained. Furthermore, the Song Dynasty's commercial economy had expanded even more dramatically than the Tang's had. The volume of trade required even larger quantities of currency in circulation. Additionally, the availability of copper was further strained because so much of it was being used for making Buddhist statues and other non-monetary purposes. The government, concerned about this drain on its copper supplies, actually prohibited the private use of copper for non-monetary purposes. In the Sichuan province, a region that had special significance in the earlier flying money system, merchants began developing a more sophisticated version of the paper certificate system. Around the 10th century and into the early 11th century, private merchant companies in the capital city of Chengdu began issuing deposit receipts to customers who left valuables, not just coins, but also precious metals and goods at their shops. These receipts came to be called jiaozi, which translates as exchange medium. The jiaozi represented an evolution of the flying money concept, but with significant differences. The jiaozi system emerged from the practical needs of merchants operating in Sichuan. Many wealthy merchants in Chengdu found it more convenient to leave their heavy iron coins with trustworthy merchants or deposit shops rather than carrying them constantly. In exchange for depositing their coins or valuables, they received a paper receipt that documented what they had left on deposit. Crucially, these receipts could be transferred from one merchant to another. They became exchangeable instruments, passing between merchants' hands as a form of payment for goods and services. Around the year 1008 CE, 16 of the wealthiest merchant companies in Chengdu jointly undertook an extraordinary innovation. They began printing standardized vouchers on paper made from bamboo bark. These printed notes incorporated sophisticated security features. They included patterns, secret passwords, markings of various kinds, official seals, and multiple marks of identification. The denominations were temporary. They could be filled in based on the coins actually paid by the person receiving the receipt. These printed jiaozi circulated as payment vouchers among merchants, and they proved remarkably popular. The success of jiaozi sparked a financial crisis that would eventually reshape the entire system. As jiaozi became more popular and more widely circulated, the merchant companies issuing them realized something important. They did not need to keep 100% of the coins deposited with them. They could issue more receipts than they had coins on hand. In other words, they invented fractional banking. This allowed them to issue far more jiaozi than the deposits actually warranted, and they could pocket the difference as profit. This is precisely where the system encountered problems. As the merchant companies issued more and more jiaozi without maintaining adequate reserves, a financial crisis became inevitable. Some companies became unable to redeem their certificates for actual coins. People who held jiaozi suddenly discovered that the paper they clutched was worthless. The merchant company that had issued it was bankrupt. This probably constitutes the world's first bank run, as merchants and customers rushed to exchange their jiaozi for actual coins before their specific merchant company collapsed entirely. Confronted with the chaos threatening to destroy commercial confidence, the Song government decided to intervene decisively. In the year 1023 CE, the government took a crucial step. It nationalized the jiaozi business. The government established an official bureau called the Jiaozi Wu, the Bureau of Jiaozi or Office of Exchange, headquartered in Chengdu. The government demonetized all privately issued jiaozi certificates and replaced them with its own official government-issued jiaozi. This was not merely a reformulation of the existing system. It represented the creation of something entirely new, the world's first government-issued paper money recognized as legal tender. The government's jiaozi differed fundamentally from the private certificates that had preceded them. The government issued jiaozi in standard denominations, with fixed values printed clearly on the notes. The earliest government issues, beginning in 1024 CE, included denominations of 1 guan, which was equal to 1,000 wen of copper coins, and extended up to 10 guan. The government later adjusted these denominations based on economic conditions and the quantity of currency needed in circulation. These government jiaozi were printed on paper and featured sophisticated security measures designed to prevent counterfeiting. They were stamped with multiple colors of ink and featured various security marks and seals. The printing facilities were sophisticated operations for their time, equipped with special wood blocks and capable of using multiple colors of ink simultaneously. The first printing factory for government jiaozi was established in Chengdu, the same city where private jiaozi had first emerged. What made government jiaozi revolutionary was not merely that the government issued them, but how they functioned. Initially, jiaozi could be exchanged for actual copper coins at government exchange offices, but this quickly changed. The government gradually moved toward a system where jiaozi circulated as paper money, backed primarily by government authority and public confidence rather than by a full reserve of coins. The government could accept jiaozi in payment of taxes and duties, which gave them inherent value. People needed jiaozi to pay their taxes, so they valued jiaozi even if they could not redeem them for full value in coins. The development of paper money would have been impossible without two prior Chinese inventions: paper itself and block printing. Paper had been invented in China centuries earlier, traditionally credited to Kai Lun in the early 2nd century CE, though evidence suggests paper existed earlier. By the Tang Dynasty, paper manufacturing had become highly refined, and paper was readily available and relatively inexpensive. The quality of paper improved over time, and by the Tang Dynasty, paper suitable for currency was readily produced. Similarly, block printing had been invented in China and was in widespread use by the Tang Dynasty. Buddhist texts and other religious materials had been printed using wooden blocks for centuries. When merchants and the government wanted to create standardized jiaozi, they simply adapted the existing printing technology. Copper plates and wooden blocks could be carved to reproduce the designs, denominations, and security features needed for paper money. The printing process was sophisticated. Notes were printed with multiple colors of ink applied in specific patterns. The size and quality of the paper needed to withstand handling and currency circulation. Printers had to ensure that the prints were clear and legible, while incorporating security features that would be difficult for counterfeiters to replicate. These technical challenges were solved through experimentation and refinement. By the time the Yuan dynasty took power in the 13th century, the printing and security features on paper money were quite advanced for their era. The benefits of paper money compared to metal currency were compelling and remain relevant today. First and most obviously, paper money was vastly lighter and easier to transport. A merchant could carry a year's worth of transactions in a small bag of paper rather than in chests and cartloads of coins. This alone revolutionized the mechanics of commerce. Second, paper money freed up precious metals for other uses. Copper, which had been used extensively for coins, could now be employed in manufacturing tools, weapons, religious statues, and household items. The Tang Dynasty was conscious of this benefit and sometimes explicitly prohibited the use of paper money in certain regions specifically to preserve copper coins for export or strategic uses. Third, paper money allowed the government to regulate the money supply more precisely. Unlike coins, which existed in fixed quantities once minted, paper money could be issued or withdrawn from circulation according to economic needs. This gave government monetary authorities tools to influence the economy in ways previously impossible. Fourth, paper money was difficult to counterfeit compared to making counterfeit coins. Coins required the ability to cast metal and create convincing seals and markings. Paper money required printing plates, specific inks, particular paper, and knowledge of the security features. While counterfeiting was not impossible, it was sufficiently difficult that the risk of severe punishment acted as a deterrent. Despite the remarkable success of paper money, it carried within it the seeds of a fundamental problem that would plague every subsequent attempt to use paper currency. The problem was inflation. Because paper money had no inherent value and could be produced relatively easily by government printing presses, governments faced a powerful temptation to print more money than economic activity actually required. When excessive money was printed, each unit became less valuable, prices rose, and the purchasing power of people's savings eroded. The Tang Dynasty's experience with inflation illustrates this problem vividly. Initially, the government managed jiaozi relatively carefully. Paper money was issued in limited quantities, and old notes were retired on a regular basis. Citizens were given a limited window during which they could exchange old jiaozi for new ones, and then the old ones would cease to have value. This system worked reasonably well for nearly a century, actually. Commerce flourished, trade expanded, and the monetary system functioned relatively smoothly. However, over time, the Tang government fell victim to the same temptation that would trouble governments throughout history. The government faced enormous expenses. The Tang Dynasty was never entirely in control of all Chinese territory. There were rival dynasties like the Jin and later the Yuan that contested for power. The Tang had to maintain massive armies. Additionally, the Tang court spent lavishly on itself, supported large numbers of Buddhist monks and religious institutions, and had to finance an increasingly enormous bureaucracy. To pay for all these expenses without raising taxes to unbearable levels, the government simply printed more jiaozi. The consequences became increasingly severe as the 12th century progressed. More and more jiaozi were put into circulation without corresponding increases in the goods and services available for purchase. The value of each jiaozi note declined. It took more notes to purchase the same quantity of goods. Prices, measured in terms of jiaozi, climbed higher and higher. By the 13th century, the situation had become dire. By 1246 CE, an estimated 650 million strings of jiaozi were in circulation, though the actual economic output had not increased proportionally. The exchange rate between jiaozi and actual coins became increasingly unfavorable to jiaozi holders. The Tang Dynasty attempted various remedies, but none proved effective. The government tried limiting the total amount of jiaozi in circulation, but it lacked the political will to actually stick to these limits. It tried converting old jiaozi into new jiaozi at unfavorable rates. In some cases, 5 old notes would be exchanged for 1 new one. But this only destroyed people's confidence in the currency further. By 1264 CE, just before the Song dynasty itself was conquered by the Yuan dynasty, the Jiaozi system had essentially collapsed. The paper money that had once seemed like such a revolutionary and beneficial innovation had become nearly worthless. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty conquered China and established rule around 1271 CE, they found themselves inheriting the lessons of Song paper money. Rather than abandoning paper currency, the Yuan rulers decided to continue using it and even to expand it. The Yuan issued their own paper money, called Jiao Chao, beginning in 1260. However, the Yuan dynasty made a different choice than the Song had regarding the backing of currency. The Mongol rulers decided to create a fully fiat currency, with no backing in precious metals or commodities. In certain regions of the Yuan Empire, paper money became the only acceptable form of currency. Copper coins and silver could not be legally used in these areas. This made the Yuan paper money system the world's first truly fiat currency money that had value purely because the government declared it to be legal tender, without any backing in material goods. Initially, this system actually worked better than might be expected. The Yuan government managed its paper currency issues more carefully than the late Song government had, and inflation was moderate rather than catastrophic for several decades. However, the fundamental problem of paper currency remained. As the Yuan dynasty faced fiscal pressures, particularly the enormous costs of military campaigns and maintaining control over its vast Mongol empire, the government eventually began printing money excessively again. By the 14th century, as the Yuan dynasty approached its collapse, hyperinflation had returned. The paper money became so debased that people preferred to use barter or other means of exchange. When the Ming dynasty replaced the Yuan in 1368 CE, its rulers initially continued using paper money. The Ming issued their own notes called Da Ming Bao Chao, or Great Ming Treasure Notes. However, the Ming dynasty eventually abandoned paper money entirely around 1450 to 1455 CE, concluding that the repeated inflationary cycles associated with paper currency were too disruptive to the economy. The Ming dynasty returned to silver as the primary currency, and paper money did not become common in China again until centuries later. One of the most intriguing aspects of the paper money story involves the Venetian merchant and explorer Marco Polo, who traveled to China during the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century. Marco Polo spent considerable time in the court of Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty, and he observed the paper money system in operation with great interest. His detailed accounts of Chinese paper money are among the earliest descriptions of this revolutionary system to reach European awareness. Marco Polo was astonished by the paper currency system. In his writings, he described how the government printed paper notes bearing the Great Khan's seal, how these notes circulated as currency throughout the vast Yuan Empire, and how merchants readily accepted them as payment for goods and services. Polo noted with apparent amazement that this paper, which represented no intrinsic value, was nonetheless universally accepted throughout the Khan's dominions. He described how the government maintained a monopoly on the right to issue paper money, and how forgers and counterfeiters faced execution. Marco Polo's accounts provided Europeans with their first reliable descriptions of paper money in operation. However, his reports did not immediately inspire European governments to adopt paper currency. The development of paper money in Europe took a different path and occurred much later, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries. This is striking because the technology of paper money had existed in China for nearly 600 years before Europeans finally began to adopt it. The invention of paper money during the Tang Dynasty and its evolution during the Song Dynasty had profound consequences that extended far beyond China itself. The development of paper money represented more than just a new means of payment. It embodied new concepts about money itself. It showed that money did not need to have intrinsic value to function effectively. Money could be representative, a claim on value rather than a repository of value. This idea eventually transformed global finance. The Chinese paper money system also demonstrated early versions of concepts that would become central to modern economics and finance. The government's issuance and regulation of paper money foreshadowed the role of central banks in modern economies. The experience with inflation taught important lessons about monetary policy that governments could not simply print unlimited quantities of money without consequences. The security features developed for paper money, multiple colors, serial numbers, and specific marks prefigured modern anti-counterfeiting measures on modern currency and security documents. The concepts of credit and representative money that emerged from the flying money and Jiaozi systems influenced the development of banking and finance throughout East Asia for centuries. Korea, Vietnam, and other neighboring civilizations observed the Chinese experience with paper money and adapted similar systems for their own economies. The spread of paper money through Asia during the medieval period shows how financial innovations, once proven successful, diffuse through adjacent societies. Furthermore, the paper money story reveals important truths about the relationship between technology, economics, and government authority. Paper money became possible because the technology of printing already existed. Demand for a more convenient form of payment created pressure for innovation. Government recognition and backing were necessary for paper money to function as genuine currency rather than merely as exchange notes. The economic activity generated by paper money created both benefits and new challenges. The invention of paper money during the Tang Dynasty must be understood as part of a larger pattern of extraordinary innovation that characterized Chinese civilization during this period. The Tang and Song dynasties were periods of remarkable technological, cultural, and economic advancement. Alongside paper money, the Chinese developed or refined gunpowder, the compass, advanced printing technology, porcelain, and countless other innovations that would eventually transform the world. Paper money was perhaps unique among these innovations in that it emerged directly from practical economic necessity rather than from military or technological exploration. Merchants and government officials needed a more convenient way to conduct transactions, and they developed paper money to meet this need. The innovation was adopted and refined over centuries, eventually spreading beyond China to influence global commerce. The story also illustrates the complexities of financial innovation. Paper money solved real problems. It reduced the burden of transporting currency and facilitated long-distance trade. However, it also created new problems, particularly the challenge of controlling inflation when currency could be created simply by printing. Chinese dynasties never fully solved this problem, and successive governments fell victim to the temptation of printing money to cover fiscal deficits.